Welcome to the internet, your gateway to adventure.
The last night before the last day brought forth only one thing: a terrible nightmare. We were all sitting around the table, discussing aspects of the case, most notably the inconsistencies in the defense. It seemed like a relative slam dunk. The affected jurors seemed fine and didn't bring up the oddities that have been plaguing us. Then, something atop the door ceiling scurried around. We all looked up as black dust drops onto the table. There was a knock at the door. The bailiff opens it from the outside, and in walks Anthony Mino, the lover of the late Jessica Willis. He does a lap around the table as we sit silently. He then drops to his knees and chants something I can't remember. The whole ceiling above the table falls, seemingly from the mountain of black dust resting on it. From the dust comes forth the entity that has been plaguing us for the last week. It gets bigger than I could have imagined and takes one whole side of the table, both affected jurors and otherwise, and elopes them in his cape. When he retracts his arm, the revelation is gruesome. All of the people that were covered by the cloak, or cape, or whatever it was, are basically sitting piles of skin and organs, their bones seemingly removed. The entity jumps off the table and grabs the person who is trying to get to the door open to run, but having no luck in opening it. It then balls up the woman like a piece of paper, blood getting everywhere, tosses her to the side like nothing. The rest of the jurors, besides myself, suddenly spontaneously combust. They run around screaming, but no smoke is coming off of them. Only more black dust falls where their skin should. The thing then jumps back on the table and crawls towards me. I'm sitting at the end of the table in pure shock. It inches its way towards me, and I finally see its face. It's exactly as Lysandra described. Pure evil, hate, rage, and all the negative emotions wrapped up in one horribly twisted face. It lunges at me, and I wake up. It was easily the most vivid nightmare I've ever had. I called Lysandra, who coincidentally had the same dream at the same time. As she would soon find out, all of us affected did. All of this had something to do with Anthony Mino. Myself and the rest of the affected jurors met at a 24-hour diner near the courthouse shortly after. It was about 4 a.m. and talked until court that day. It turns out Trinette had foregone her outward displayed sanity and asked the other jurors if they had addicts, to which most responded yes, so we still don't know why we were chosen instead of the rest of them. It was time for court, and we walked into the courtroom, the six of us weary about what might potentially happen. Both sides made their closing arguments. The defense basically threw his away and just begged us to find him not guilty. He looked so disheveled. Surely someone in the building had asked him if he were hungover. His eyes were baggy, and I noticed black on his fingertips and palms. He looked worse than we did. It was finally time. None of the affected jurors sat at the end of the table. Of course, 6 of us held out, while the other 6 immediately said guilty, and then began the long explanation of what had been happening to us and why this weird lady was inquiring about all of their house's attic space. They looked at us like we were crazy. Rightfully so. We sat in the room for hours, trying to convince them that something else was going on, and to look past the obvious pitfalls in the defense. We said that whatever this was affecting the defense attorney too. It came time to go outside and tell the judge that we hadn't yet reached a conclusion. We all walked out, and I saw the defense attorney open his briefcase. When we delivered the news that we hadn't yet agreed on a verdict, the defense attorney took a revolver out of his briefcase and handed it to John Willis, who promptly put it in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The defense attorney followed suit, killing himself as well. There was an unmistakable, inhuman shriek that followed. We barely had time to react before we were taken out of the courtroom and placed back into the decision-making room. We were there for what seemed like hours, but what was in reality only a few minutes. We were rescued from our jury duty and informed that the police would arrive soon to get our statements, which they did. Everyone told what they saw, and we were released. I returned to my hotel room, hoping the ordeal was all over. Boy, was I wrong. I opened the door to the room, and it was covered. I mean, absolutely covered, from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with black dust. Naturally, I went to the room and investigated. Just kidding. I ran out of there like I stole something. Doing what I should have done immediately after being released, I regrouped with Marcus, another of the affected jurors, and we decided to see what was up with Anthony Minow, since he had appeared in all of our dreams. He lived just outside town on a small farmland property, and as soon as we got there, none of us felt welcome. There were strange things hanging from the trees, sticks that made weird shapes, hay bales, and certain patterns that I can't rightfully describe. He walked up to his door and knocked. He opened his door, revealing himself to be dressed in a hooded robe, with black makeup painted on his face in different shapes and patterns. Before we even got a chance to say anything, he spoke.
He lives above, and he takes below.
Well, hello to you too, Mr. Minow. We asked him what had been happening to us and why, what happened to John's family, and why John and his attorney killed themselves. Surprisingly, he answered our questions relatively straightforwardly. To what happened to John and his family, he said Anthony became fed up after his 2-year affair with John's wife. Years earlier, he had lived in New Orleans and became a practitioner of hoodoo. You called it. He decided to get rid of John by using a certain spell to conjure an entity that would kill him. Only the plan backfired. The entity became inflated with John and wanted nothing more than to consume him and make him his own. Apparently, John refused to give in to the entity, and as punishment, it killed his wife and sister. To the question of why we have been affected and not the other jurors, he said, according to him, this entity feeds on belief. It's relatively simple, actually. The more someone believes in and fears the entity, which does indeed have a name, I just can't for the life of me pronounce it, let alone spell it, the more powerful it becomes. It wears down people's facilities, drives them nearly insane, then takes their mind and soul back to hell with him, where they apparently live as his eternal slaves. The reason we were affected is because it saw victims in us. We were near enough to John that it observed us and knew it could take us. The reason the other jurors weren't affected was simply that they don't believe in paranormal or supernatural things. I thought I didn't believe in this stuff, but apparently I do. Apparently I do enough to the point that I've been giving this thing power. It can be many places at once, and it always takes up shelter in the areas above someone. If someone didn't have an attic, he'd stay in the rafters underneath the roof of their home. If you lived in an apartment complex underneath someone else, it would stay hidden in the upper unit's area, leaving no traces behind besides a trail of black dust. Simply put, the more you give into it, the more powerful it becomes. When I asked why John and his attorney committed suicide, his answer was pretty straightforward. They killed themselves because they realized they would never stop being taunted by this entity and took the only way out they knew. Makes pretty good sense if you ask me. Of course, we asked Anthony how we could end this curse. He gave us a list of instructions and some different spices, salts, and plants with directions on how to use them. Kindly enough, he gave us enough to distribute the rest of the jurors, all while apologizing to us profusely, saying he never meant for anyone else to get hurt because of this. He said he must follow his instructions to the letter, or we will lose the battle and be taken down to hell with the entity. No pressure, right? We left Anthony's and relayed the information and distributed the items amongst them, and all went our separate ways. I followed his instructions as closely as I possibly could. First, I had to go back home and put the salts and spices around the entrances/exits to my house, doors, windows, that kind of thing. Not to keep the entity out, but to keep him in, because he's already there. He apparently preys on you when you're tired, according to Anthony. Can only take someone to hell at precisely 10:28 p.m. Don't ask me, I'm not the magic entity bringer-upper. Then I took a bunch of the herbs Anthony gave me, crushed them up best I could, put them in a circle in my living room, and took a bunch of the black dust I've been finding everywhere from a bag of it Anthony gave me and covered the crushed up herbs in an effort to disguise it. The reasoning for this is that when the entity travels back to hell, it does so through a portal made from its dust. I would agree to him in hell, and he would enter the portal. He would be trapped within the circle of herbs, which he cannot cross back from. Anthony explained that he could willingly cross into them, but not out. Then I waited until 10:20. At that time, I began calling out for the entity, saying I'd given up and wished to join him. It took until 10:24 for me to hear the attic stairs fall down, and then to hear the entity slide his way down into the hall. It reached my living room, stood up in front of me, and I'm not going to lie, I peed my pants a little bit. I'd never gotten a look at this thing from the front before. Its body underneath the cloak was hard and scaly, a dark green color to its cracking skin. I've already described its face. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, having to duck underneath the banister in my living room. I again stated that I'd give up and wished to join him, if it would only lead the way. It walked up to me, and I stood my ground. It loomed over me, as intimidating as something could ever possibly be, and it breathed down hot, putrid breath upon me. I nearly vomited when I inhaled it. Black dust fell from its shoulders onto me. I claimed I constructed a portal for it, and again that I wished to join it, if it would just lead the way. It stared at me for a few minutes, then turned to the circle I'd made. It apprehensively went towards the circle, inspecting it, looking back at me to see what I was doing every few seconds. Eventually, it stood just outside the circle and presented an arm, welcoming me into it. Thinking quickly, I replied, "I am your servant. I never walk before you." It stood for a moment, let out a scoff, and entered the circle. I quickly turned around, lifted up my couch cushion, retrieving the papers Anthony had given me with the things I needed to say to banish the thing from my home forever, and so I did my best recantation of the following text. Ti albal time deruba mi ni ibi yo ja omi na pai omi ati nai nipa nia banish okan won sonu nothingness ki osi yo won agraba titi ti o kanhin kakri ja ki awan wani babura anis sa napas ekol ikwa ati I kun. Suddenly, I heard the same screech I'd heard in the courtroom earlier in the day, and the floor within the circle burst into flames. The entity then stared at me with its lack of eyes and slowly dropped onto the flames. Once it was completely submerged, the flame cut out, and all that was left was a pile of black dust. Needless to say, I couldn't believe it. Anthony told me that the spell only works in my home, so if I were to move, I would need to do a protection spell against it in my next residence, so I will now forever be the target of it. If that's the case, I'm never moving. Pretty simple. I called the others, but only 2 responses so far. Marcus and Lysandra both reported that their spells had gone identically to mine, and they both said they felt safer already. I don't know what happened to the rest of the affected jurors, but I do hope they went the same way. I'll update this post if I hear from them or about them. I don't know if this was the resolution you were looking for or hoping for, but it's the resolution of what's been happening to me. I don't know if I feel safe yet. I guess time will tell. Thank you all for your support and advice through this ordeal. I know myself and the rest of the jurors have benefited from your kind words and tips throughout battling this thing that we were just unfortunate enough to become haunted by. I thank you all again. And please message me if you have any questions. Be sure to check back in the next few days for updates on the remaining 3 jurors. Be well, everyone.